Material differences. Chapter 3. Breadcrumbs and plasma cutters. Jaeger stood on the mountain gazing up into the storm clouds gathering overhead. He could see its eyes piercing the dark clouds at the center, could hear its million voices screaming in rage and anger. He stood there on that mountain calmly reloading, waiting for it to strike. When the arm came swinging out towards him, it was an arm made of 1,000 bodies, 100,000 more, clinging together as best they could to make up that massive appendage as a veritable god swung down to crush him. He wasn't afraid, however. She was by his side. "You're going to have to get the kids involved, you know," she mentioned while chambering more rounds into her launcher. "I know," Jaeger replied with a shrug. "They'll do well, though Raven thinks she's all sneaky trying to creep in on me while I sleep. I don't blame her. You're adorable when you sleep. So peaceful and serene. Before you can open your fat mouth and let reality ruin the illusion." They both chuckled after she said that and looked up at the god of 1,000,000 souls about to smash them to pieces while they stood on top of a mountain of dead bodies. Human, bot, and synthetic. "You afraid?" "Not even a little," he replied as he raised his launcher. Even as he began to fire, he could hear General Odinson's voice echoing in his ear. No surrender. Only death. He opened his eyes before the hand the size of a house came crashing down and looked up at Raven standing over him. He took a slow, deep breath then, and blinked once to get a bit of the sleep from his eyes and wash away the last of his dream with the clarity of consciousness. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, and slid over a bit in the bed but still under the covers, so she could climb up onto the edge and cuddle in against his side. "Bit too excited. How come you're never surprised when you wake up? You look so peaceful and serene, so nice. Then you just open your eyes. Not like people in movies and shows at all." Jaeger chuckled and reached out to brush back her color quills as he gently stroked her face. "I wouldn't base normal human behavior on what you see in shows and movies," he said with a little shrug. "Well, I mean, aren't you even surprised to have someone standing over your bed? I could have been anyone," she mentioned as she looked up at him. "You waited at the door for 10 seconds to try and tell if I was awake yet. Then you opened the door 8 seconds ago and walked in, standing over me until I woke up. I knew it was you the whole time," he replied simply and smiled as she looked amazed. "How do you do that? You looked totally asleep," she insisted. "Practice. You're more aware of your surroundings in your sleep than you think. You can train yourself to use that knowledge to never be surprised. And I've had a lot of practice. A lot." He decided not to add that the main reason he had so much practice with it is because back in training, if you failed to wake up in time, the DI would draw genitals all over your face. Male, female, human, xeno, sapient, or other. Jaeger still wondered just why his DI was not only a very talented artist, but why he had such an extensive knowledge of genitals. Alas, it was a mystery that he would likely never solve. "Well, now that you're awake, can we get going?" she asked, and he snorted before shaking his head and ruffling his hand through her quills to mess them up and make her giggle and pull back from his hand. "It's too early. I told you when we'd leave." "That's still our schedule." He yawned slowly then and stretched out, nice and wide as his muscles quivered a little from the motion. "But it'll be dark when we get there if we leave when you want," Raven replied with a frown. "That's the point. Now go on, you've still got your chores," he said with a nod to the door. "Already did them," she replied quickly as he frowned a little. "How early did you get up?" he asked then as she bashfully smiled. "Told you I was excited," she said as means of an answer. "Well, all that means is you have to be awake and wait longer now." As he told her that, she groaned out and leaned back, nearly falling off the side of the bed as she made such an exaggerated gesture of her disappointment. "What if I do your chores? Then could we leave sooner?" she asked, then trying to negotiate as if this were some sort of haggle. "No," he said with a soft chuckle. "We need to get there as it's getting dark. We're not going in there like normal people, and you know that. Now go play with Rex for a bit or something." He shooed her away from his bed with a wave of his hand as she did roll off the edge now to her feet and head out. "Maybe I'll go ruffle up Sasha's fur so she has to clean herself all over again," Raven mentioned as possibility. Jaeger just rolled his eyes and shook his head as she left. Once she was gone, he reached under his pillow to move his knife back behind the bed and then tossed the sheets back and got up. He took a moment to walk to the window and look out over the dunes speckled with small bushes and the ocean in the distance. So much space. A vast, wide-open horizon that looked like it could go on forever. He would never get tired of that sight. Not after growing up in the stacks. At this point in the morning, the clouds were a light gray hanging low in the sky. Not foggy, just hazy. The layer of clouds light enough that the sun seemed to diffuse a soft light across everything instead of any direct spots. Some of his favorite weather. After sighing softly, he headed into the suite's private bathroom to take a shower. All chrome, black marble, and Salavian redwood. The material in this bathroom likely cost more than the entire stack he lived in as a kid. He still relished the design. Sleek, luxurious, functional. For all their mistakes and sins, one couldn't fault Absolute Dynamics in their sense of style. The shower even had 3 pulsar shower heads on the walls to go with the overhead rainmaker mount, not to mention the detachable head in the corner, though he never used it. All this for what was just supposed to be an on-site executive suite in case someone stayed overnight. He could only imagine what the old site manager's house looked like. Hell, it was probably still there somewhere in the Silver Cliffs overlooking Old City. Probably a palace for some king scav these days. Jaeger turned the water on and quickly disrobed as the water would be hot in mere seconds. As he tossed his shirt and silkies into the hamper, he also had to give Absolute Dynamics credit for making the most comfortable and durable underwear ever conceived of by man. Once he stepped into the shower, he gasped softly as he adjusted to the torrential downpour of water being dumped onto him. When he was a kid, he loved to play around in the shower, when he actually got to take one, but these days he just stood there, forehead pressed against the marble wall as he let the water wash over him, as if it could scour away his sins. It took him a minute to finally work up the discipline to actually clean himself off, and not just stand there in the perfectly heated water that was on the edge of warm and hot just as he liked it. After he had showered, he dried off with a hot, fluffy 2.5-meter-long bath sheet that were waiting for him in the bathroom's heated towel closet. He wasn't sure why they insisted on calling them bath sheets instead of bath towels. Were towels too small? But who used a sheet to dry off? Shrugging it off, he hung up the bath sheet to get laundered and got dressed, unable to resist a soft sigh as he pulled on a pair of warm silkies fresh from the dryer. Automated laundry was simply the best. Once he had pulled on the rest of his clothes, he walked out and down the hall to a window overlooking the garden. He could see the dirt looked wet, so Raven might be telling the truth about doing her chores. Likely meant she'd need a midday charge if she got up so early. He spent the next hour or so going about his own chores. First, he headed to the command center in the security wing to double-check the various sensors and vid feeds from around the compound. Then he changed up the bot patrol routes across the dunes so they weren't the same as the day before. After that, he printed out the day's access codes, memorized them, and then ate the small slip of paper they'd been printed on. After that, he gave the various power lines a quick check. Wave turbines were all green. Geothermal looked good. Shard reactor was stable. The water purification station and sewage were all operating normally. Maintenance bots were reporting low levels of operation. They'd built the place to last 100 years or more, and it really showed. Redundant systems that were all built to last, not to mention the salvage bots just waiting for commands out in the dune bunkers. He could have become warlord scav of the whole coast from here if he had the mind to do it. But he didn't. With all of that checked over, he headed to the kitchen to prepare a refrigerator pie for Max. He'd made up the crust the night before, so all he had to do was get the oven going, mix together the eggs, cream, cheese, ham, spinach, onions, and spices, and set it in to cook. Then put some of the fresh bread from last night in the toaster oven and scrambled up the rest of the eggs with cheese, seasoned salt, and the last of the creamy garlic Alfredo sauce he had in the fridge. Normally, he'd never use up so much precious dairy in a day, but since they were headed up the coast, he might as well restock on some things they couldn't get locally. Just before the eggs were cooked too much, he took them off the heat to let them finish on their own so they'd be nice and soft. "Raven!" he called out and slid half the eggs onto a plate for him, the other half for her, and a piece of toast for each of them. When she came into the kitchen, she was bundled up in her olive-drab, scorched outfit, though she hadn't put the mask on yet. "Something I was wondering," she said as she sat down and began to spread cider on her bread. You mentioned being poor as a kid, but you seem to know all kinds of stuff to do with bread and dough. Yeah? Jaeger asked as he waited for her to be done so he could smear the cider onto his bread as well. I thought fresh bread was like, for rich people. She shrugged as that was the extent of her wondering, apparently. Wealthy is the man with fresh bread and soft butter for a meal, Jaeger said. Some kind of quote my mom used to say, and it depends. Making fresh bread really isn't hard, as you've seen. Just a matter of if you've got the time or inclination. We couldn't get meat much, but my mom always made sure we had bread, though mostly we just had sourdough from the starter. He nodded to the jar on the counter with the bubbling starter in it. From your mom, right? Raven confirmed as she looked at it. Yeah, it might be all I have left of my mom, actually, Jaeger mentioned with a sad sigh. Though that starter is technically older than me, or my mom. I'm not sure how far back it goes in the family, but it goes at least to my grandmother. He told her as she blinked in surprise. Really? How? She looked back at it. I mean, it's alive in the same way as, say, a plant. It's not sapient or anything. You have to feed the cultures and take care of it. But if you maintain it, then you've got unique family bread for life and beyond. That's a taste of Earth, and a specific place on Earth, too. That's why you can never find bread quite like it. He nodded to the jar as Raven kept staring at it with a little bit of wonder now. What would happen if you kept feeding it? Would it get larger and larger and larger until I could blob around and eat people and become a sapient blob yeast monster? Raven asked as she raised her arms in the air and made a little roar noise which made Jaeger laugh. I think you'd just have the world's largest loaf of bread, though it would probably be burnt on the outside and still doughy in the middle, so I wouldn't recommend it. He took a few bites of the eggs then, savoring the creaminess of real fat and dairy in it, as Max slowly stumbled into the room. Morning sunshine, Jaeger welcomed him with a smirk. Max was most certainly not a morning person. Despite being synthetic, he still had to rub the sleep from his eyes a bit as he pulled back a chair and more or less collapsed into it, as if his body couldn't sustain his weight for a moment longer. Heading out today? Max asked blearily. Yep, I've got refrigerator pie in the oven. Got, Jaeger checked his watch. 5 more minutes, then you can take it out and let it cool. What did it used to be called? Back on Earth? Raven asked as Jaeger frowned at her. There used to be another name for it. Something fancier. Quiche, Jaeger finally replied when he realized what she was talking about. That's it. How come you always call it refrigerator pie? She asked as she tilted her head to the side a moment, and then used her toast to shovel more eggs onto her fork. Because I'm not French and it sounds too fancy. Quiche sounds like it needs to be served with some sort of fancy plates and all kinds of garnishes. But refrigerator pie sounds far more casual. Plus, that's what my mom always called it. He shrugged it off as he ate more of his eggs. It smells good. Max mumbled for a moment, and then suddenly looked at Jaeger with a highly suspicious look on his face. Wait a minute. What did you put in it? He turned his head to the side a little and squinted at his dad as if expecting some sort of betrayal. Why do you say it like that? Jaeger asked with confusion. Far as he knew, his kids always loved it when he made it. Mostly it's good, but I'm always wary about it ever since you made that one fish abomination a while back. You have some odd ideas about what's tasty sometimes, Max accused as he wagged a finger at his dad. What? The smoked Salavian salmon and capers? That was delicious, Jaeger insisted, scoffing at his son's sudden disapproval of his dish from months ago. No, that was delicious, Max agreed with a nod. I'm talking about the culinary abortion you made later. With the fish-like things in a can, if that's really what it was. Jaeger squinted a bit as he had to think about what Max was saying, trying to figure out what he was referring to until it hit him. The anchovies? Yes! That! That was awful. Max shook his head. What? That was great! Jaeger was shocked that his son had hated it. He'd thought it had been a great flavor. That great salty, fishy fish taste. I like that taste. It tasted like it smelled, and it smelled like a fish's butt, Max replied, which made Raven giggle. You're crazy. It tasted like the ocean. You don't like that taste? Jaeger countered. You're the crazy one here. If the ocean smelled like that, I'd puke every morning I woke up. When you make fresh food, it's just about always good, sure. But when you start digging out sludge in a can from the old days, I begin to wonder about your sense of smell. Max shook his head as said that. I've ruined you two with too much fresh food, Yeager mockingly replied. What about you, Raven? Did you like the anchovies? As he and Max both looked at her, she froze with her forkful of eggs right before her mouth. She glanced between them for a moment. I plead 5, came her answer. You plead what? Yeager asked with a confused frown. I plead 5, she repeated and then stuffed her fork into her mouth to make a show of being too busy eating to answer any more. Yeager turned his confused expression to Max, who just gave him a similarly confused shrug as neither understood what she meant. Regardless of all of that, there's no anchovies in this one. Yeager pointed to the oven. It's the usual fillings plus the last of the ham. Max gave him another suspicious stare. What? The real ham or the fake ham? He asked. It's all real ham, Yeager insisted and scoffed once more, but Max just kept staring at him. It's not the ham in a can, if that's what you mean. It's the last of the roast. But the canned stuff is real ham, you know. Not that I'd waste emergency supplies on your breakfast. He wagged his fork at Max. It might contain real pig product. That much I'll concede. But it's most certainly not ham. Ham doesn't come in suspicious cube form that florps out of the can onto a plate and jiggles like it's trying to win a dance-off. Max countered with a shake of his head. You two are just so spoiled. Yeager scoffed and took a bite of his bread with a satisfying crunch. Max shrugged it off and went to the side of the kitchen to prepare himself a breakfast shake in the blender. So you're heading out with your armor, then? Max asked, as he mixed powders, base, ice, and fruit into the blender. Yep. Yeager nodded as he scraped up the last of his eggs. Taking the rhino out, then? Max glanced back over his shoulder. No, Yeager chuckled and shook his head. We're taking the hatchback. You're a revenant. It really doesn't make sense to go out in a beat-up old hunk of junk instead of one of the most advanced tactical urban combat vehicles they made before the war. Max shook his head, and Yeager waited for him to use the blender before replying. Once the whir of the motor died down as Max got his shake to the right consistency, Yeager spoke up. Your assault is showing, he joked. The rhino is completely and utterly wrong for something like this. The point is to be unnoticed, subtle. You should appreciate that Mr. Infiltration model. As he said that, Max shrugged and took a big gulp of the shake from the glass container of the main blender, not even bothering to pour it into a cup. Yeager chuckled as he saw his son with a big pink mustache then. Got a cover if you get stopped? He asked. Clinic. He nodded to Raven in her outfit as she lifted the mask to show Max. What if someone decides to check? Max asked as he finally realized he had a big pink shake stash and licked it off his lip. Trust me. They won't, Yeager insisted. Take the mask off a scorch to check? Trust me. They won't. It's an organic thing. Max shrugged then and drank more of his shake as he walked out of the room with it. Yeager's watch went off then, and he got up to pull the pie from the oven as Raven behind him quickly gathered up the dishes to clean them off. What else is there to do? He idly muttered aloud and slowly scratched his chin as he watched Raven squirm from the corner of his eye. All right, let's go. Finally, she exclaimed as he finally gave the go-ahead. He was going to go upstairs and grab his day bag, but noticed she'd already stacked it with hers by the door. He smirked a bit and grabbed his pack as they headed from the kitchen into their living room. It was really part of a lobby and waiting area back in the day with an old automatic piano in the corner, leather couches, chairs, and marble coffee tables. But the luxurious old layout was now more dominated by various projects that Raven and Max were both working on. From fixing up old bots to art, Yeager had once made an attempt to keep the place tidy, but he gave up years ago. Not just because there was little point in keeping it clean as if company was coming over, but also because he liked the bit of clutter in the common space. Helped bring them out of their rooms and do things together. Gave it a more lived-in feel that he appreciated. Some of Raven's old watercolors fluttered a bit from where they were taped to the display case of old awards the facility had won. In the corner, however, was an elevator that they stepped into and hit the button for the tram level. There was only a soft hum to indicate they were moving before the doors opened again to reveal the level. They stepped out onto the small tram platform where the sphere was waiting for them. All along the walls were posters from other absolute dynamics facilities around the verse and void. Binary, Core, Europa, Mount Olympus, Pacifica, Soslo, and many more. You ever go there? Yeager looked to see where Raven was pointing, and nodded at the big poster of the Red Haven Glade facility here on Solavis. Yeah, it was gorgeous back in the day. Trees as big as skyscrapers some of the time. Well, small skyscrapers, I guess. But high enough up that you couldn't see the ground from the tops, or the tops from the ground. Would have been my second choice after this if it wasn't lost in the war. His mind went back to his last memories of the facility, engulfed in flames. He'd never seen a forest fire before then. Not up close. The sheer scale had always been lost on him before that. To see a massive wall of fire rising up and consuming acres at a time. He had heard so much screaming as they flew out of there over the city. To hear one person burning to death was tragic. To hear a city going up? It was almost too much for a person to truly comprehend. The voices blending together into a terrible cacophony that mixed with the sounds of the fire itself. He'd never before wished for the Albatross to have louder engines. I'd like to see it one day. Yeager was pulled out of his thoughts as he tried to wonder why his daughter would ever want to be exposed to something so truly and terribly awesome in the worst of ways. That's when he realized she obviously hadn't followed him into his own memories. The forest, you mean? The facility's gone. Yeah. It seems so lush and picturesque. Does it really live up to the famous art and pictures? She asked as they boarded the sphere. It really does. Did, he corrected. Takes those trees a very long time to grow. Not sure how much it's recovered since then. He hit the button to take them to the garage as the sphere began to move along the track that was laid under the facility. Despite being built on the coast, the facility had extensive subterranean facilities thanks to the solid bedrock that just happened to rest in this area. A kilometer outside the fence, up or down the beach, and it was mostly sand. How come everything seemed to be hit so much harder by the war than the wars before it? Raven asked, as they traveled through the tunnels. Well, Yeager had to think about that. I think because the Void Wars before it were more about nations against nations still. There were more discernible front lines and battles between soldiers. This one was messy. The lines broke down. The people rose up. Soldiers were engulfed into ideologies that made friends into enemies and enemies into friends. You had what was left of governments fighting Megacorps, fighting the church, turned Hive fighting a mix of terrorists and freedom fighters, and just about everyone had different goals and agendas. When nations go to war, they usually have some sort of objective in mind. Usually resources, be it the rights to something or space or territory. But when ideologies go to war, the only objective is all too often the complete eradication of everyone who doesn't believe what you do. Is that why the pact came together in the end? Raven asked, and he nodded as the sphere slowed down as it approached the garage. The Ideological Defense Pact. A collection of people willing to work together to bring about the end of the war. Because while they might not all agree with each other, they could agree on core beliefs, like destroying the Hive. No one could do it alone at that point. Of course, if you're only working together because of a common threat, how will you survive once the threat is gone? They can't even agree on a new name for their stupid peacetime government, so everyone just calls it the Pact still. Yeager scoffed a bit. They've got a long way to go to really prove themselves as any coherent and decent government. That's part of why recovery is so slow. It's little more than a collection of various remnant militaries, desperate to hold on to what territory and resources they still have. But they do offer some level of protection against bigger threats, without levying outrageous taxes on the people they protect. Plus, they have open elections, and far as I'm aware, they actively fight corruption. All good signs. He shrugged, unsure as to what the true fate of the pact would be in the years to come. I'm sure they'll hold together. I can't imagine anyone is interested in big wars or conflicts after the last one. Not while everyone is trying to rebuild and recover. Yeager smiled at his daughter as she said that, full of hope and optimism. He didn't feel like pointing out to her how often people had thought no one would ever go to war again, because the last one had been too terrible. Eventually those who survived it would die. Then all that would be left were faded memories of the strife. Then those memories would fade and it would all begin again. Not even the Mesmemori could keep those memories alive in enough people to end war for good. For who wanted to relive that sort of pain? An old wound made fresh through your own eyes or that of another. That twinge in your heart when you thought of those you've lost. Wars are all too often started by people who have never experienced that pain, or worse, those who feel that pain all too readily, and think the only way to heal their own is to inflict the same pain onto so many others. But the ache is always there. Almost always, he corrected as Raven smiled at him, and he couldn't help but reach out and wrap an arm around her shoulder to pull her against his side. I'm sure you're right. With that, they got out of the sphere, walking into the underground garage to the hatchback. Among the Rhino, luxury sports cars, or even the Clydesdale, there was a beat-up old gray hatchback. There was a rusted scratch along the front right corner panel, and the back left wheel was different than the others, but it still worked great for a car almost as old as he was. Walking around back, he opened the hatch and then pulled open the trap door where the spare tire would be normally to reveal his armor and gear tucked neatly inside. He tapped the charging light, which flickered green to make sure the spike was ready to go, and then closed it once more, setting his and Raven's bags on top, and then setting in his usual emergency gear besides it. "What are we taking in to barter with this time?" Raven asked as she stood next to some bundles he had along the wall. Just a food run, so I'd say just grab the steward bundle." He nodded as she grunted and used both hands to barely pick up the bundle before waddling over to him with it. It was a collection of domestic steward bots broken into scrap. Common haul, yet still valuable thanks to the high-end polymers and circuits they used. Once she got to him, he picked up the bundle one-handed and set it into the back of the car before shutting the hatch. Then he opened the driver's side back door to check the plasma cutter he had strapped to the back of the driver's seat. "Why do you use that instead of a gun when we're trying to be subtle?" Raven asked, as she got into her seat up front and buckled up reflexively even before they got going. "Because just about all my guns are military grade. While some wouldn't be too unusual, it may still draw concerns, or they might be against the law now. I'd rather not risk it. And this," he hefted the plasma cutter in his hand for a moment, "is the greatest weapon Sol Heavy Industries didn't know they ever made." "What do you mean?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. Or rather raised set of color quills formed into an eyebrow. The engineers who made this only thought of it as an industrial tool. But let me tell you, when you create a tool that can fire a cohesive bolt of ionized plasma that cuts or melts through a target, that's gone beyond a tool. They couldn't see the forest for the trees. Just started selling the main production model before the war broke out. But let me tell you, it got weaponized very quickly. Seeing an old engineer with a plasma cutter as a weapon won't draw any attention. And despite how deadly these things can be, they won't outlaw them because the ones they have left are too valuable, and it's not like it's easy to get more ammunition for them. He strapped it back into place then. "But I thought you could make more in the manufacturing wing," she asked, and he just glanced at her for a moment. "Right, it's not common for people to live in a facility like this." "It is not common, no," he agreed and closed the door before finally getting into the driver's seat. After buckling up, he turned the key and the engine purred to life easily. While the majority of cars used push-button starts for generations now, the low-end models used old-fashioned keys. It was simply too easy to use a fob spoof to steal the nicer cars that it meant thieves would avoid the old-fashioned ones. Besides, who could drive a manual these days? He smirked and put it into gear as he slowly drove towards the entrance. The doors rumbled open as sand spilled in. They were just wide enough for the car to slip through and then closed behind them, and more sand spilled down from the top of the dune to make the bunker entrance look like all the other dunes around it. While the old road around the facility would take him to the gate, he headed straight north out across an old trail that would lead them to a path through the dunes north of the facility. He'd take that out a few kilometers before taking another trail onto the main road, so people wouldn't have a chance of seeing a car entering or leaving the compound. "Look, the seals are out today." Yeager looked to his left as she pointed out to the ocean. Just up the beach were the rusted remains of a few literal ships, their husks now home to Mohawk seals sunning themselves on the warmed metal. They could hear their braying in the distance as they drove. A few would look up as they drove by, multicolor Mohawks rising up for a moment in surprise before they'd smooth back out, realizing they weren't a predator. "Why do so many animals just lay around all day and sleep in the sun?" Raven asked as they drove on. "This coming from the girl I found passed out with Sasha and Rex the other day?" he asked. "Okay, you know, in my defense, it was really warm and cozy at that moment. and I was a little low on charge, and just whatever. My point still stands. She huffed and crossed her arms. Jaeger chuckled softly and reached out to turn the radio on. But all he got was static, so he turned it off after a minute of trying to find anything. Well, I guess it's a day for singing, he smiled wide at her. Oh, no, Raven groaned out. He might be a single dad to two synthetics, eking out an existence in the dead remains of a world only slowly coming back to life. But he was foremost her dad, and that meant annoying her sometimes. 100 bottles of beer on the wall. 100 bottles of beer! He belted out as loud and off-key as he could while her groaning increased, though they were both drowned out in the barking of the seals as Jaeger drove on toward what he hoped were answers, and what he feared would be danger.